Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing the new film Mank. This film was directed by David Fincher. David has not made like a feature-length film in the normal sense in a really long time, and I've missed him. I think the last film that he did was Gone Girl, at least for movies in the theaters, and I found that film to be very, very interesting. It was very rooted in his strengths in that it was still, like an investigative thriller, a murder mystery sort of thing, but he was also kind of branching out into things I hadn't seen from him, like suburban satire and this sense of humor. I just think overall it was a win all around, but now he is back with Mank, and this is a film that has actually been in his life for many, many, many years. It was originally written by David Fincher's father, the late Jack Fincher. It was written in like the early 90s, and I think in the mid to late 90s, that was around the time that Fincher had planned to direct an adaptation of it, but it didn't work out, and it was one of those, I guess, personal passion projects that finally now with, a Netflix deal he was able to do. And of course, this is about Herman Mankiewicz and his fight for authorship and screen credit for the screenplay for Citizen Kane with Orson Welles. It is based on the very infamous essay that Pauline Kael wrote on the same subject. And that essay, I think you can take with a grain of salt, but that's not really the point. I think Fincher is really good at taking material that when you read it, or storylines that you might be skeptical of, and then he transforms them into something else, into very sophisticated cinematic fare. For me, Zodiac is the quintessential example of that, and it is coincidentally my favorite Fincher film. I think it's a masterpiece. And going into this as a Fincher fan and as somebody who is a film critic and who knows a lot about the subject matter from all kinds of different angles, this is a movie that naturally makes sense for me to watch. So I strap in and I'm ready for the experience, and I'm watching the film, and the thing that just, your initial gut reaction to the film naturally is that this film has a major sense of cheekiness and a smugness, a sense of humor. It is beautifully shot and just well put together with a lot of class, naturally, because it is David Fincher, and whether you're a fan of his or not, I personally expect nothing less. He is a meticulous master of his craft and one of the most notoriously detailed filmmakers in existence, at least in American film. And yet, throughout the movie, I found myself struggling the entire time, and not because it's a bad film per se, because I don't think it's a bad film. There are elements of it that I think are pretty strong and do work, but I see it more like, I see that more on a scene-by-scene basis, where you can take certain things out of context. When you add everything together, the sum of its parts just isn't clicking for me. It never felt harmonious. There's just this disconnect between me and the screen that I could never get past. And of course, this is me talking about it just from, an initial viewing. Perhaps I'll feel differently if I see it again, but just based on how I feel right now, I'm very torn on it, because I think there are things, as I said, that should be of note, that I think are special and worth your admiration. But I gotta be honest, I was really bored a lot of the time watching it. I could never get invested in it. And it has nothing to do with the source material, because again, I think that what Fincher does so well is take material like that and put a different spin on it, or open it up in very interesting directions that you wouldn't normally think of on the screen. But it was more in the actual execution of the story and in terms of how it unfolded as a film that was, for me, really difficult to emotionally engage in. And for the type of film that this is, you'd think that this would be kind of my wet dream, but it wasn't. So I'm thinking throughout, as I'm trying to formulate my opinions and they're starting to appear out of the fog, I'm thinking like, what is it? What is it that's not working for me? There's gotta be something specific. Yes, it is very expensive, and it is smug in those ways that, cheeky Hollywood satires tend to be about movie making. At times clever and at times funny, but it never for me really moved beyond the smugness of it. It never really became something truly reflective and personal, though it hinted at it, especially in the third act. It never really went all the way for me, and it lacks a lot of the tension that I really love in a film like Zodiac, and it lacked a lot of that emotional resonance that you feel all the way through as an arc in something like The Social Network. And for me, ultimately, it lacks the heart and, again, the emotional resonance of the film that it is mirroring in a very meta sort of way. Citizen Kane. And I don't think that Citizen Kane is the most emotionally engaging film in the world, actually. I think it's one of the lesser ones for Orson Welles in terms of, being a director, but you know, this film is naturally meant to mirror Citizen Kane by design. And so naturally the film structure is going to be designed in a sort of elliptical, jumbled sort of way. And stylistically, I was a little bit confused about that because it's trying to mimic it, sort of, for sure. There are definitely a lot of references, visual references and things to Citizen Kane, and yet it's not fully going into Orson Welles' auteur aesthetic. It feels more like it's trying to be partially influenced by Welles in terms of the visual style, but it's also consciously trying to be sort of like a parody of like late 1930s, early 1940s era aesthetic. And as it stands, again, if you take a lot of these individual scenes and individual sequences out of context, they're beautiful. The mise-en-scene, the detail, just the sense of control in terms of the visual compositions, the contrast and the editing. There's a sequence in it that is edited so brilliantly to me. So meticulous and well choreographed, but part of me wishes that it had gone more towards the more Wellesian sort of look and really delved into the meta aspects of things. Because when you look at Welles' style, it works. You'll find very few people that won't look at certain shots of his and be like, well, that's just really boring. It's kind of impossible. I think it would bring out a lot of interesting ideas in this new production, just that angular sort of German expressionist inspired theatrical style. I've always said a Welles movie looks like different shots and it looked like panels in a manga, that the deep focus resonating so strongly and the heavy contrast to me is what creates so many definitive shapes in a lot of those shot compositions. Hence why Welles and his style is so memorable. And when you compare this film, especially to something like that, to me it's lacking that distinct dramatic flair that I think could have served it well just in terms of what it represents within the story. Just more of a commitment to it, because there is a crispness and a sharpness to Citizen Kane that just isn't captured in a movie like this, even though it still looks impeccable, again, out of context. I just wanted some life in it. I wanted life to be breathed into it because I wasn't feeling that pulse. And there's a lot going on in this film thematically. It's trying to be very, I think, self-aware, but to a fault. You know, you have themes here that are about art imitating life, the idea of an artist's personal experiences working their way into the art, and even vice versa. Then there's the political propaganda angle, the social angle, the sensationalism of media that, you know, resonated then and certainly does now. And the film is touching on all of these ideas, but never really delving into them in a way that I find to be very satisfying. It never, again, is moving beyond that self-mockery, that self-referential nature. And when you have all of these ideas trying to work together as some sort of mechanism to build the core of the story, to me, it felt a bit sluggish and slightly unfocused. But I gotta bring it back to the two earlier Fincher works that I mentioned, because I couldn't help but be reminded of these two films throughout the movie, and that would be The Social Network and Zodiac. And I use those examples because in that the tension really does build, and there is a sort of structural coherence, and the emotional stakes are just higher. I use Zodiac more from a structural standpoint because it's similar to this in the sense that, you know, you start off with the Jake Gyllenhaal character, but then he goes away for a while and we focus on other aspects of the film. And it's not till much later that we come back to him and he finally, as a protagonist, is choosing to realize their full potential in that point, or take it upon themselves to accept that call to adventure. I use Zodiac as an example, you know, more from a structural point of view, just because it does remind me of Mank quite a bit, just because you've got the Jake Gyllenhaal character who is the protagonist in the beginning of the film, but then he goes away for a long period of time. We're focusing on other aspects of the Zodiac killer, and then we return to Jake Gyllenhaal, because that's the point where he finally realizes that it's his time to realize that full potential. He can finally accept that call to adventure, and in this instance, I believe that it really works. I know some people don't think so, but for me, it does. And I think there are aspects of that do work in Mank, because I did find myself most interested in the final act of Mank. A lot more so than I did the first half of the film, for sure, because it's Mank finally realizing what he needs to do, and he's finally striving for that potential that he seeks. He is finding his rosebud in so many ways. So with Zodiac, it's taking on this B-story sort of cheap fare, but it's a sophisticated, introspective look at, I think, artists, especially Fincher himself. His need to find answers in a sort of existential sense through the art form that he's choosing. And he's doing it all through the romanticism of nostalgia and how that affects our thoughts, how it affects our needs for answers, but how in the end we rarely ever find true answers. And there's something about this particular film that to me is more cerebral than the rest, especially in his more murder mystery investigative thrillers. He certainly touches on a lot of these ideas in Seven, and I love Seven. That's a film that I absolutely adore, but it's just not as well done to me as Zodiac. That film just takes the ideas further, it's more mature, it's more nuanced. And Mank just doesn't have that for me. It lacks that climactic build, and I think especially because of its variation in structure. You look at Citizen Kane, and again, it's very similar in terms of the way that it is built, and yet somehow, even amidst the jumbled structure, it never feels like you can't follow it. You're never like, wait, what is going on? Where are we? No, it somehow still builds so brilliantly as if it were told in chronological order. It never feels elusive or cluttered, and I think partially it's because we're getting the story from all of these different unreliable narrators, and that's part of what contributes to it. You know, a huge part of Citizen Kane that is emotional is the idea of memory, the pain of nostalgia. And with Mank, again, they're doing a similar thing, but it's gotta gel, it's gotta work. And the jumbled nature of things actually made me feel less for the characters, and therefore the conclusions just feel less satisfying, lost in a lot of its own ideas that I think it's trying to convey. The smug nature of the dialogue and the loneliness and the confliction of the main character certainly reminds me a lot of The Social Network, which, you know, for me, that film nearly perfectly executes that idea from a storytelling point of view. There are 3 key scenes in the film that to me reveal Zuckerberg's rosebud, if you will, and they all have to do with Rooney Mara, all told in 3 separate acts, 1, 2, and 3. The first scene of the film is him on a date with Rooney Mara, and you know, she gets really annoyed by him, so she leaves the date. It makes him angry, and it fuels him to go ahead and make Facebook. And then the next scene that they run into each other, he tries to apologize to her, but it's a very half-assed apology. She gets even more offended. He leaves, he gets upset. And what does he say? We have to expand the Facebook. And then the final heartbreaking moment is where he tries to add her on Facebook at the very end of the film. And he's constantly refreshing the page to see if she accepts the friend request. And that to me is a really pathetic but super relatable sort of thing. Zuckerberg's ability to unite the world digitally, and yet he is completely unable to connect personally or emotionally to any of these people. And that is kind of the representation of the millennial generation, the aimlessness, certainly, that Fincher captures beautifully. And here, it's all there, it's all clear. The spine of it, the emotional payoff is key, and it works 1, 2, 3, like clockwork. That is good writing. And there's an aspect of the way that tale is told that I kind of wanted more in Mank, so that it kind of was more balanced. Because the point is that at the end of the film, Mank has to recognize a lot of his failures as a person, and he's got to rise above them, and he does. And he does so partially by asking for screen credit from Orson Welles. But also he needs to be able to recognize how a lot of the things he's writing do mirror his own life. So again, this is a very ambitious script and an ambitious idea to take on. So I do give Fincher props for attempting it. I just can't be as enthusiastic about it in terms of the final result. And as I said, I do not hate it. I think it's fairly entertaining. There are some good lines and some good moments in it, but the center just felt very hollow for me, and the cheeky nature of the script and everything can only take you so far before it sort of hits a wall. It reminds me a lot of Oscar bait, quite frankly. It reminds me a lot of the kind of movies that you would watch maybe for like a history class and take a test on it, but you'd never watch in real life. And I really don't know who the target audience for this is supposed to be. That part of it is very confusing to me. So it's all very puzzling why now this is being made and what the motivation behind it is. I have looked up very little on this movie. I know almost nothing about Fincher's motivations for it other than it's been in his life for a long time. And I guess if you're a fan of Herman Mankiewicz, and I am actually just as a real man, as a screenwriter, and if you're a fan of Orson Welles and Citizen Kane and the history of it, or you just like film history in general, this might be one that you might want to check out just out of initial curiosity. But beyond that, it's hard for me to really recommend just because there are so many Fincher films that I find to be so much more engaging. And, you know, for a casual Fincher fan even, I don't think this is the movie for you. So yeah, overall, just disappointed, not necessarily angry, not necessarily offended at all, but just disappointed. As I always say, you know, when people are like, what did you think of the movie? And I didn't particularly care for it. I'm like, you know, it exists. And that's how I feel. This film exists. And that is my review. Thank you guys so much for watching. All of my Patreon supporters are listed over here. Thank you guys so much as always. Also, if you are a Patreon member, I'm doing holiday discounts for commissioned portraits. So if you want to know more information on that, you can go to Patreon. Below I have a link. I do commission portraits. I am an artist and I sell prints of my work as well. So if you're interested in any of that, just check out my website, deepfocuslens.com. Go ahead and email me if you have any questions. It's been really fun so far and I'm happy to work with anybody new who's interested. Beyond that, all of my social media information is below. You can watch more videos here and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.